Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One man, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
A ní wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Namnukwa, Osinachi. One man, Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama, Osinachi.
It's time. So how do we start? Okay. Greetings, everybody. Good evening. Am I audible and visible to everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Very well.
Good. So I welcome you all to session 2J of this year's LSA conference. This session is one of the Author Meets Readers sessions. And here we'll be engaging with Chigbo, author Anyaduba's new book entitled The Postcolonial African Genocide Novel, Quests for Meaningfulness. I want to ask greetings from my home institution, Adekunle Adashi University, and of course from the LSA itself. I'm really happy to be here. I can see Chigbo. It's been a long time, Chigbo.
Been a long time. It's good to see you again.
I see Catherine, Sakiru, and a few others. So I welcome you all on board. Sorry, you will excuse me if I cough intermittently or clear my throat. I have a very bad cold and cough, but I'll survive this session. So I welcome you once again. We have very limited time, just about 1.5 hours, and I would wish that we maximize every minute of it. So I'm just going to put 1 or 2 guidelines in place. The first is, if you don't mind, I'd like that we address ourselves without titles, just by our names, whichever is convenient, first name, surname, but just by our names. And then I'll also suggest that we do a time distribution, even from this point. We have a panel of 5 discussants. I think 4 of them are here already, or 3. I can see 2, no, 3. So we're expecting 2 more. We have 5. I'm going to suggest 10 minutes for each of them. That gives about 50 minutes. The introductions and things may take another 10 minutes. So that's about an hour, so that we have at least 30 minutes for the respondent, author, and questions. I think this is fair enough. Having said that, we're going to start straight away, and I want to start with, well, I will introduce the speakers very quickly. Sikiru Adebayo, University of British. Can you still hear me?
Bro. Yes, I can hear you. I just wanted to say that the other 2 panelists are unfortunately not going to join us today.
Okay.
So
so we have a little more time.
Yes, that's
okay, so that gives us some 20 extra minutes. So we can go up to 15 minutes for each discussant. And that still leaves an extra 5 minutes for you and questions, which is good. Thank you for the information. So from what I see, we have just Sikiru Adebayo, Catherine Baxter, and Christopher Oma. I'm sorry if I haven't pronounced your name well. So those three are the ones we have here, and they are the ones we are going to have this evening. Welcome once again. So by way of, I'm going to start by introducing the person for whom we are gathered here. Again, it's Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba, and is an assistant professor of English at the University of Winnipeg, whose teaching and research interests on African literature, postcolonial literature, genocide and literature, critical race studies, and cultural studies. He had his bachelor's and master's degrees at the Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife, Nigeria in 2008 and 2013, respectively, BA and MA, and his PhD at the University of Manitoba in 2018. A significant part of his research explores the cultural representations of genocides and mass atrocities in Africa. Anyaduba is a recipient of several prestigious awards, including a Vania Canada Graduate Scholarship for his doctoral dissertation at the University of Manitoba, and a J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Fellowship at the University States Holocaust Memorial Museum for his research on genocides in Nigeria and Rwanda. We can see him, flesh and blood, and we will hear him very soon. A few words on the book that we'll be engaging with this evening. The post-colonial African genocide novel, Quest for Meaningfulness, can be described as a big book on the important subject matter of the issue of large-scale trauma and indeed genocide in continental Africa. It comprises 269 pages, published in 2021 by Liverpool University Press. The book is divided into two parts. Part one is titled Writing Genocide in Africa's Post-Colonies. And part two is entitled Artistic Quests for Meaningfulness in the Hells of Post-Colonial African Genocides. The book is a welcome entry into the scholarship of trauma on the African continent. While the Rwandan conflict and genocide has been the most narrativized on the continent, Anyaduba's book brings similar conflict spots in Africa under the discursive ambit of trauma scholarship. Let me point out that Anyaduba's text is located within a combined framework which serves the author's objectives well. On the one hand, there is the Holocaust, a framework that appeals instantly to Western sensibilities of horror. And on the other hand, post-coloniality, a framework that evokes global South recognition of the complicity of the same Western nations in the tragic unfolding of genocidal tendencies in Africa. The book, therefore, engenders a global recognition for multiple perspectives. The twin framework enables the author to frame genocide simultaneously as a human tragedy and worldwide phenomenon, and as a experiences. When Wayward pages, truth and morality are co-casualties. This is symbolized in the images of women in conflict caught in crossfire and the body as negotiating part in the battle for survival. But it is not just the female body. The manner in which all bodies matter within the context of genocidal conflicts is a question that I think scholars of trauma, violence, and genocide ought to pay attention to. Finally, there is the issue of the definition of memory. I'm not sure now if this has been raised before as a theoretical issue or where, and I'm saying this with every sense of responsibility. I'm not primarily a trauma expert, so I don't know. I just want to point out that memory is also mnemonic. It serves not just as a reminder of the past, but also as a reminder or warning of what may yet happen in the future if care is not taken. And I think we see genocide loading in some of the trouble spots on the continent. Trouble spots to which to watch out for currently include Ethiopia, where a civil war continues to rage, Central Africa region, where there is continued military conflicts with insurgents, nearby Cameroon, with continued oppression of the Anglophonic Southwest region, and even Nigeria. In Nigeria, devastation caused by Boko Haram terrorists, bandits, herders, kidnappers has spread suspicion and escalated tensions between the North and the South. A book like this not only reminds of genocidal wars, but implicitly warns about trouble spots. It is my hope that the scholars who are discussing this book will also avert their minds to some of the above issues. I thank you all for listening, and I want to immediately invite Sikiru Adebayo of the University of British Columbia to start what I know will be a very interesting engagement this evening. Thank you, Sikiru. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Omotaya, for this, really stimulating intro to the book, and just for a wonderful introduction in general. And I really want to appreciate Chigbo for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and also just sending my greetings to the other members of the panel. It is nice to see you again, Christopher, and it is nice to meet you, Catherine. So I'm just going to read my my response to the book, and I will start by saying congratulations, Chigbo, for writing a very brilliant book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I also learned a lot from the book. I wish and I told you this yesterday, I wish I had read this book earlier. So Chigbo Arthur Anyaduba's book, The Postcolonial African Genocide: Quests for Meaningfulness, published by the Liverpool University Press in 2021, is a study of African novels that deal with the question of genocide. In this book, Arthur investigates how literature makes genocide in Africa thinkable and consequently meaningful. The investigation stems from what Arthur describes as the apparent truism of genocide studies, which is that the reality of genocide, especially in the context of fiction, resists meaningfulness. Put differently, Arthur, as I understand him, argues that contrary to the prevalent notion that the experience of genocide defies understanding, literature may actually be an anchor in our quest for meaning to genocidal occurrences in Africa. Also on this quest to find a productive hermeneutics of genocide in Africa, Arthur implores us not to take the meaning of genocide as an objective reality that is out there, but as something that is produced or socially constructed in discourse. Therefore, he looks at what he terms the post-colonial African genocide novels, not simply as novels that depict genocidal violence, but as novels that actively participate in the production of the meaning of genocide. And I think this is the most, for me, important point of the book, which is that we don't go into those novels thinking that we already know the meaning of genocide. It's actually how the novels, complicate our understanding of the meaning of genocide. So in other words, Arthur does not go into his analysis with the assumption that the meaning of genocide is already a given. Instead, he goes into the analysis with the aim of finding the meaning of genocide in the selected novels in the book. Arthur's literary analysis cut across genocidal contexts of Rwanda and Nigeria. He examines novels that deal with the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi in 1994, as well as the Nigeria-Biafra War that happened between 1967 and 1970, but was preceded by the Igbo pogrom of 1966. Of course, for me, there is a huge question about the implications of reading the Nigerian Biafra War as genocide, but that is something that I will get to later. For now, I want to say that Arthur offers incisive and insightful readings of Chimamanda Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, Wole Soyinka's Season of Anomy as genocide novels in the Nigerian context, and Gil Kotman's A Sunday at the Pool in Kigali, as well as Boubacar Boris Diop's Murambi, The Book of Bones, as genocide novels in the Rwandan context. In his analysis, Arthur devotes attention to both form and content in order to tease out the semantics of genocide that these novels offer. In other words, Arthur employs both a formalistic and a socio-historical style of literary criticism in order to excavate the multiple meanings and layered textures of genocide that the selected novels bring to the fore. So from his analysis, what I understand as Arthur's inferences are in four folds. So Arthur's inferences from his analysis in the attempt to find meaning to the obscenity of genocide are in four folds. First is that African novels usually present genocide as an encounter with, as well as a journey through hell. And hell here is both literal and metaphorical. Secondly, he argues that African genocide novels conceive of genocide as ritual sacrifice. Thirdly, he argues that African genocide novels curate a kind of genocide memorialization that is understood as a moral imperative, which is that, the writers of these novels write with this sense of moral responsibility or moral duty to remember and to not repeat, for history not to repeat itself. And fourth, the fourth inference, which I am hoping that Arthur might speak a little bit more about, and I think that Omotayo also raised in the introduction, is the question of aesthetics. That's the part that wasn't very clear to me in the book, where Arthur argues that African genocide novels employ the aesthetics of naturalism, which propels graphic narratives of suffering inflicted on the body. Some of these inferences or motifs, Arthur argues, emerge from the fact that African genocide novels draw from the representational conventions and practices found in Holocaust literature. Part of the rationale for the presence or the specters of the Holocaust in African genocide novels, Arthur explains, is because sometimes these novels are either written by a Westerner, in the case of Gil Kotmanch, for example, or written in a way that makes genocidal violence legible to a global, which is invariably a Western audience. While Arthur acknowledges the importance of the Holocaust as a point of reference for African writers attempting to make sense of genocide on the continent, he also points out that this attempt is flawed in certain aspects. For example, he notes that this approach of relying on the Holocaust as a frame of reference is flawed when one considers the United Nations Genocide Convention's definition of genocide, which is obviously indebted to the Holocaust. Arthur argues that this definition follows a teleological course from intent to action, which might not necessarily be the case in African contexts, where even though there is a genocidal action, the genocidal intent is often a gray area. In the same vein, Arthur notes that the reliance on the Holocaust as a frame of reference for genocide representation in Africa overdetermines, quote, the explanatory and moral evaluative frames through which African genocides have been conceived of and responded to in art as well as in real world, end of quote. I could go on and on about what Arthur says or does not say in the book. But at this point, I want to raise a few points or a few questions which I would like him to comment on, in addition, of course, to my earlier inquiry about the question of aesthetics. My first question is one that Arthur is not unfamiliar with. What is the purchase of construing the Nigerian Biafra War as a genocide? Yes, the atrocity fits into the United Nations Genocide Convention's definition of genocide. But again, in the book, you actually disagree to some extent with that particular definition. You also stated clearly that not all instances of mass killing is genocidal. And more importantly, you raise the point about the importance of intentionality in the execution of genocide. Therefore, are we saying that the intention in 1967 is to exterminate all the Igbos in Nigeria? You would agree with me that the event was a civil war. And in every war, there are at least two opposing sides. In the case of the Holocaust, it was not a war between the Jews and the Nazis. It was an intentional extermination of Jewish people. In the Rwandan case in 1994, it was not exactly a case of the Tutsis fighting back. It was, to a large extent, a one-sided battle, at least between those 3 months of the genocide. The Jews, and to a large extent, the Tutsi, had no agency. But correct me if I am wrong, the Igbos fought back. And I think it is important to accentuate the point that the Igbo fought back, not necessarily in defense of the Nigerian federal government, but as a way of pointing out Biafra's heroism, even in the face of immense adversity. The situation becomes even more complicated when we factor in the minority groups within Biafra itself. Does the claim to genocide or the claim of genocide extend to the minority group within Biafra? And so if that is the case, is that a regional attack more than an ethnic attack? And how does one negotiate Igbo genocidal claims when minorities in Biafra were also victimized by the Igbos during the war? A very good literary example that just came out, of course, is New York, My Village by Uwen Akpan, which kind of explores the sufferings of the minorities within Biafra during the war. When does one draw the line between a proven and a presumed genocide? More importantly, this is a question and a comment at the same time. I wish the book touched more on the question of justice. What does justice look like for Biafra today? And how do the selected novels deal with the question of justice? The other point, which will probably be my final point, is that I would like Ato to talk about. It's the question that I would like Ato to talk about is the question of the nation state in the event of a post-colonial crisis. Somewhere in the book, you did touch on the limit of the nation state, which you argue is one of the legacies of colonialism. So you touched on the limit of the nation state in the discussion and negotiation of post-colonial conflicts. And I'm asking this question particularly because of my own interest in employing a transnational approach to studying post-colonial African conflicts. We know that the study of the genocide of the Tutsi is incomplete if one does not factor in the role played by Rwanda's neighboring countries such as Uganda, Burundi, and even Congo. What are the implications of the colonial legacy of the nation state in civil conflicts in post-independence Africa? Again, the Nigerian Biafra War is all about the nation state. It is about who is allowed to remain or not remain within the sacredness of the nation state. The genocide of the Tutsi is also partly about who is counted worthy of being a part of the nation state. And for that reason, I'm wondering how we may put the question of the nation state to the fore in the discussions of political conflicts in post-colonial Africa. And I would appreciate any thoughts that Arthur might have on that. Once again, congratulations on writing this very fine book and for making a fantastic contribution to African literary scholarship. I think I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sikiru, for that very insightful presentation. It's raised so many questions, but I don't want us to be distracted, quote unquote, now. I want us to run through the three presentations as quickly as possible so that we can engage, begin to engage with the issues that emerge. So I'll immediately call on the next speaker, Catherine Baxter. You're there and ready. Thank you. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. And I'm working across two screens, so I'm just going to pull up my paper so I can see you all and then see my paper as well. So thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. It's a real privilege to be here today, and thank you, Arthur, for such a kind of rich book. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk through my comments on it, and I also have questions, but just want to say how lovely it is to be part of this conversation. Thank you, and thanks for, again, for this book, Arthur. So the subtitle of the Postcolonial African Genocide novel, I'm sorry, I'm looking down just because I'm looking at this other screen, but I'm with you. So the subtitle of the Postcolonial African Genocide novel is Quests for Meaningfulness. As I discovered as I read further and further into the book, the use of the plural quests is no accident. There are manifold quests for meaning and for meaningfulness in this discussion of the Postcolonial African Genocide novel. The Postcolonial African Genocide novel examines 4 novels in turn, 2, as we've heard, that focus on Biafra, and 2 that focus on Rwanda. And as Arthur points out, these 2 historical instances of genocide, as he posits them, on the African continent have been read in curiously and diametrically opposite ways. So the history of Biafra has consolidated as a history of civil war. And in that process, the consolidation of the violence perpetrated against the Igbo has receded into the background of discussion of that history, whether we choose to read that violence as genocide or not. Conversely, the years between 1990 and 1994 for Rwanda are told primarily as a history of that 3 or 4 months of genocide that often then displace the larger context of civil war in which that genocide took place in Rwanda. Arthur reads all 4 novels specifically as genocide novels as opposed to war novels, which they could also easily be read as, but he wants us to kind of focus on them as genocide novels. And this is because, he argues, each novel purposefully directs the reader's attention to the genocidal actions and intents that he sees in these events and that the authors do. So an important strand of the argument running throughout the book is that each author consciously draws parallels between the Holocaust of the Second World War and the positive genocides of Biafra and Rwanda. In some instances, these parallels are drawn by characters within the novels. In some instances, it's the author themselves who invites the comparison. But whichever way they're introduced into the narratives, Arthur's point is that these intentional parallels constitute a claim on the part of the authors that the events can and should be understood as genocide. Okay, so what has this got to do with questing, which is where I started? So, as Arthur persuasively argues, each novel represents a quest on the part of its author to make sense of, to find meaning for and in the genocide that it makes its subject. Moreover, in each novel, we find primarily male protagonists who themselves are questing for such meaning. So in Season of Anime, the questing figure is Ofei, who's a kind of Orpheus figure who must traverse the depths of hell to recover his wife. In Murambi, the quester is Cornelius, who we are invited to read as a version of the biblical Cornelius, whose encounter with Simon Peter leads to his conversion. And Cornelius is in search of his own origins, and the revelation that he receives is the violent involvement of his own family in the genocide of Rwanda. In Half of a Yellow Sun, the quest motif is more dispersed across multiple protagonists, but still tangible in the sexual politics to which Arthur draws our attention. And similarly, in Sunday at the Pool at Kigali, the quest is dispersed, but it importantly shapes the Conradian arc of the novel, whose white protagonist seeks self-meaning, Marlowe-like, through his distinguishing himself in his own eyes from what he perceives as the barbarity around him in Rwanda. But as Arthur illustrates, we can read the novels themselves as questing things. The novelists, he suggests, use their narratives to try to understand and to explain the causes and the meanings of the genocides on which they focus as genocides. This is why, he argues, the authors repeatedly turn to the Holocaust as a point of reference. The Holocaust gives conceptual form to the atrocities of Biafra and the Rwandan Civil War. But in each example, Arthur throws into relief what gets left out by the novel's shared motifs of questing and the Holocaust. What we are missing, he claims, is the practical, specific, political and social context out of which the two genocides emerge. So this is more or less the case for each novel, of course. So Soyinka's mythic approach inevitably pushes considerations of a kind of these kind of political contexts to the edges of his plot. I kind of found the arguments slightly more strained around Half of the Yellow Sun, where, although the criticisms of Adicio's book I think were very well made, but I kind of thought that actually sometimes the social did come in more overtly there. Nonetheless, it's clear that the use of the questing motif, because it prioritizes the individual and the individual's travails, limits the novel's, in each case, the novel's capacity to reflect on social or political contexts. And likewise, their invocation of the Holocaust, while making the violence they describe visible as genocide, at the same time decontextualizes that genocide through transnational and trans-historical comparison. So Arthur doesn't pose an answer to these conundrums, and nor does he need to, but I was left wondering, are there alternative models of the African genocide novel that, in avoiding the quest for meaningfulness that he identifies here, find ways to represent these genocides or others through their complex political histories? And more broadly, and this maybe gets to the kind of aesthetics question that Sakiru has already raised, more broadly, does the fault lie with the form itself? So might theatre, for example, more than fiction, be the place where social meaningfulness emerges in representations of genocide in these African contexts? And it's interesting that in unpacking his title in an early section of the book, Arthur explains his choice of terms post-colonial, African, and genocide, but what remains by and large as a given is the idea of what a novel is itself. But the discussions prompt us to consider what the limits might be of the novel as a form for narrating genocide. And it's interesting that it's the two texts about Rwanda that are most experimental. Diop's in terms of its disrupted and multivocal narrative, Courtemanche's in its pornographic style. So Arthur gives considerable attention to these more experimental aspects of these novels and the ways in which they underscore the power of witnessing, another canonical Holocaust motif. But I'd be interested to hear from Arthur whether he feels this stylistic experimentation also puts pressure on the novel as a form itself. So are Diop and Courtemanche drawing our attentions to the limits of the novel per se and to the deforming pressures of writing genocide as a novel? I'm going to sort of draw to a conclusion there because I'm very interested to hear Christopher as well, and to give plenty of time for us to have our conversation with Arthur about the book more broadly. But I just want to say thank you again for this rich new study, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it with you.
Gertrude, Without wasting time, I'll call on our last discussant for his own contributions at this point. Christopher Ouma, over to you. I hope I've pronounced your name well. Ouma.
Yes, you have. It's Oma. It's Christopher Oma. And my fellow panelists, forgive my lack of video because I'm in a sort of transitory environment, and the Wi-Fi environment is not really stable. But I hope you can see me. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so I hope I can sustain, my response is quite short. So I hope I can sustain my video because the environment is not very stable. So I stick with just the voice. But first of all, I'd like to really appreciate Chigbo for this opportunity, and to say that, you know, I really enjoyed reading the book, and I think it is a very substantial book in terms of what it's going to contribute to thinking about these sort of genres of trauma in relation to the continent. And I think a lot of the points that I might have raised, Adebayo might have raised them. So I'll be very short and very, perhaps a little bit controversial, and I hope we can have a sort of broad discussion. And so I'm just going to read what I have, but I just respond to Sakiro as well. I think that the point of thinking about genocide that Anyaduba is making, that's the point, is it? That, you know, can we rethink that moment and begin to find a different definition of this term? Because it comes to us in the 60s from a very specific sort of geography and historical moment, and it doesn't neatly translate the way it should in other contexts. So I think that there's room to think about Biafra in that sense. And part of what I'm always curious about in thinking about Biafra is to locate it at that moment, which was the beginning of the Cold War. And Adebayo, I'm sure, you know, from reading Michael Rothbard's multidirectional memory, you'll see that the ways that he's locating the Holocaust in the context of the Cold War, in the context of decolonization, but he's using memory, sort of look at how the politics of how certain kinds of mass atrocities translate globally through certain sort of memory, investments in memory than others. And I think what is at stake, and you ask in your question, is the nation state. And I think at the heart of Biafra are similar questions. At the time that this sort of traumatic event happened, what were the intervening factors that would have immediately raised the global attention towards something genocidal? They might have not defined it as genocide, but what are those factors? And those factors lie in the complexities, in my opinion, of Nigeria's immediate post-colonial history. As you know, the politics of resources and oil and sort of global economic interests in that Cold War. And I think amidst all of that, so much is lost. And I appreciate Anyaduba's argument and the net effect of the argument in making us rethink that word genocide and maybe rethink it within the context of Rwanda and Nigeria. So, you know, from the outset, I think it's a worthy and a strong argument to make. And it does really underwrite some of the brilliance of this book. And my response is going to be controversial, but it doesn't take away from what I think is a brilliant book. And I think that is going to be very useful for scholars of African literature across the continent, around the world. So my response is going to be very short, and I will just pose a couple of points at the end that I'm hoping Anyaduba can respond to. So Chigbo Anyaduba's The Postcolonial Genocide novel is a ground-clearing scholarly work in the way it takes on the analytic genocide as a generative category for revising and recategorizing some taken for granted narrative context of war. By foregrounding genocide as a concept, Anyaduba attempts to measure the ways in which this term can intervene in the way we think particularly about the dominance of Holocaust studies in the scholarly characterization of contexts of war and mass death in Africa. Anyaduba focuses on Nigeria and Rwanda, revisiting the characterization of Biafra as civil war and asking his readers, as some writers and scholars have begun doing in the past, to think of Biafra as genocide, as a theater of violence that while could be characterized in comparison to the Holocaust, insists on its own historical and political logic, its own complexities. Anyaduba stresses throughout his book on a semantics of reading in which the idea of meaningfulness, or the quest for meaningfulness, is invested with a certain sort of ethical political principle. Such an ethics would recuperate a definition of genocide as part of a process and not overdetermined by the spectacular moment of its execution in the form of physical and bodily extermination. Anyaduba therefore attempts to recuperate a more expansive meaning of genocide, driven by the specific context of Africa, and therefore relatively unshackled from the monopoly of the Holocaust paradigm. In other words, Anyaduba seeks to uncanonize genocide, the nominal word, the concept and paradigm, from not only its context of formation in 1955, but also from the overdetermining influence of Holocaust studies. Anyaduba attempts to tease out various patterns of scholarship that underwrite Holocaust studies and then translate into the ways in which genocide is conceptually deployed outside of the arena of the West. In this way, Anyaduba clears some ground in the way we think about mass atrocity in the specific context of the continent, with the net effect that the word or the concept genocide is not on the one hand an empty signifier, terra nullius, as it were, or on the other, already fully loaded with meaning from other contexts, but one that is able to walk a certain tightrope in between the monopolized version of Holocaust studies and the historical complexities of the African continent that refuse easy translation into what would be an imported concept. Now, to some extent, Anyaduba succeeds in keeping this principal argument running in the primary field he has selected. So I have very few comments, questions, I suppose, that I'm hoping, not quite questions, but points that I'm hoping can generate some discussion. So the first one is, while it is fair to caution against how the concept and uses of genocide underwritten by Holocaust studies, how they dehistoricize other contexts in which they're applied in, there's also a potential danger of dehistoricizing the more decentralized processes across centuries, the pogroms and other histories that accrue to the social death of Jews towards the event of the Holocaust itself. In other words, the pogroms and the displacements that happened for 400, 500 years that lead us to this moment of the Holocaust. And often that moment is sort of patented to Nazi and sort of fascist regime and the Third Reich. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a whole history behind all of that brings us to that event. And I think one of the things that Anyaduba is asking us to think about in the context of the continent is that kind of complexities of local histories that lead us to those moments of sort of spectacular extermination of bodies. But I'm trying to also ask Anyaduba that by reading the Holocaust in certain sort of geohistorically limited ways, underwritten by Germany and fascism and the Nazi, do we also, in other words, that concept? And perhaps we also need to think about those underlying assumptions. In other words, it might be limiting to read the Holocaust's geohistorical provenance as confined to its moment of execution. And then perhaps I wanted Anyaduba to speak a little bit about what he says is this binary between the agent and structure, the agent and structure logic that defines the causes of genocide. There are people a group of scholarship that reads agency and another one that reads structure. And I just wanted him to speak a little bit about that. I'm not sure it is generative to present agent and structure, that formulation, as sort of a polemic. I'm not sure, and I just wanted him to speak a little bit about that. And I'm thinking about it because when Sakiru raises the question of the nation state, then we begin to think at a macro level the structural logic of political and cultural identity in the continent. And, you know, without saying that that structural logic is over-determining, there are people within it who make these decisions about those moments. And I think the book really does a brilliant job. And I think this is where the question of the aesthetic is important, that there's a way that novels, by virtue of their genre and the sort of infrastructure of narrative and storytelling, that they're able to walk that tightrope between certain choices that people make and the availability of choices that they have to make the decisions that they're making, which speaks to that sort of thin line between agency and structure. I often think about child soldiers, and in my own book, I have a chapter where I look at childhoods of war, and I try to engage with the aesthetic of the child soldier in the way that it has traveled over time. And one of the foundational moments of it is the Biafran War, and you know, Ken Saro-Wiwa's work. You know, so I'm hoping that Anyaduba can speak a little bit about why that feels constraining, this idea of an agent structure, or those two groups of thinking around the causes of genocide. What is the way forward beyond that what seems like a binary logic? Maybe I'm misreading. Now, the third point I want to make, which is going to be controversial, Anyaduba, I hope you'll excuse me, it doesn't take away from the brilliance of what you've done in the book. But readings on gender, I think, need to reckon with the complicated logic of intersectionality. To be more specific, the ways in which gender intersects with class in Adichie's Half of Elosan, as well as the ways in which class reproduces gendered identities. In other words, there are moments of intersection and reproduction that undermine any monodirectional and in some ways even heteronormative readings of gender and sexuality in the novel. And that's one aspect that I'm hoping we can have a discussion around. For instance, I'm not sure that Adichie sets out to make Olanna a radical sort of moral arbiter of feminine empowerment, given her obvious class status and position in this society. I think it really undermines any sense that she could be a moral arbiter of feminine empowerment. I'm also not sure about a reading that diminishes the romantic dimension of the novel in relation to what it assumes are the sort of grander themes of historical experience and mass atrocity. I think that a reading like that can lead us into certain kinds of didacticisms that need to reckon, for instance, with the field of everyday life studies. I think it needs to engage with gender in relation to the masculinist tropes of nationalism and group identity in the post-colonial world that novels like Half of Elosan try to engage with. The idea of gender is not restricted to a reading of Half of Elosan as a romantic genre. It is a critique, in my opinion, of the gendered symbologies of group identity which dominate our senses of how we interpret this historical moment. And I think a lot of the African feminist literary critical work has gone through from, I think, the 60s and 70s, really complicating the idea that romantic dimensions are not hierarchically inferior to the sort of public, what people assume are big issues of the day. And I'm just worried about that sort of hierarchy in your reading there. And then I think this is something that I think Sakiru might find. I don't know if I might be an ally, Sakiru, in this point, but perhaps some engagement with memory studies might shore up some of the ways in which these primary texts are their own unique footprint in representing the concept of genocide? Can we be, for instance, more generative and in some ways conceptually more ambitious and perhaps less predictable in talking about the intersections between genocide studies and memory studies, as opposed to genocide studies and Holocaust studies? I don't know whether those dimensions might take us to engage with some of the questions that my other panelists are asking. But I will end there. And once again, I am very grateful to Chigbo for this, what I think is a book that I will put in my syllabus immediately next semester. And I actually never got the book, the actual physical copy. I think what happened with the post, I don't know, but yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, again for another insightful contribution. I want to join others to congratulate Chigbo on a job well done. If time permits, I am particularly fascinated by the submission, the rigorous and very insightful analysis that you did of the 4 major texts, and there are 4 major African texts that you studied in the book. And especially your conclusions. I did some short summaries of your conclusions on them, which I hope, if time permits, to share with members of the panel. Having said that, I want to thank all our discussants. It's been very rich perspectives. I want to thank Sakiru, for the questions that you raised, 4 of them. I'm sure I saw Chigbo writing. I know he has the 4 in focus, and he's going to address them very quickly. Your take on your question on the focus on Biafra, asking that it's, I'm mixing, the problem of categorization of genocide. I think you touched on that. You talked about is Biafra war or a genocide? Yeah, I also asked that question. And there was a rider you provided that, was there an intentional policy, as it were, to exterminate Igbos, for instance? I thought that was a very germane question to ask. How do the selected novels deal with the question of justice? That's also very pertinent. And then, of course, you talked about the issue of nation states and so on. I want to thank Catherine for a very rigorous engagement with the subtitle of the title of the book itself. I found that very interesting. And the question she asked, especially about whether you think drama, I don't know if you picked that, whether you think drama would have offered a better context, as it were, to articulate or better portray some of these atrocities that you talked about. I want to thank Christopher for his own contributions also. And quickly hand over to, well, I think some of these other things, especially some of the ones you raised, I will also talk about it. But I want us to, because we are running out of time, I want to hand over to Chigbo so that he takes on some of these things as quickly as possible. And then we also have the opportunity to ask more questions or make more contributions, as the case may be. Thank you very much, Chigbo. Over to you.
First, I just, I don't know, I just want to say a very big thank you to all of you. It's been inspiring listening to these feedbacks, and I just feel I should sit down and just listen and take notes and not have to respond. But I mean, I really appreciate the depth you give to the ramblings in my head that became this book, and the kinds of insights that you've shared with me. I think you've been very generous with the book, and I appreciate your engagement. I also want to thank Sahid for putting this book for engagement in the conference. I don't have words enough to appreciate what Sahid is doing. Yeah, I mean, many of you were part of the process. Omotayo, for example, was hosted me at Adekunle Ajasin University, I think in 2015, when I was still struggling to make sense of what I was doing as my doctoral research. And it was a very engaging session talking about some of the questions that you've raised about genocide and whatnot. You know, again, it came up from the questions students raised, and I remember your interventions that day. So thank you again. I think what I want to do is just to go through quickly from the notes I have here for not exactly a response to the questions you've posed, but yeah, something a bit like a response that could invite you to say more, right? But that's I think I agree with all your readings of the book and the critiques that you offered. So for a day, I think, yeah, one of the major questions, which I believe Christopher and Catherine sort of answered in their own responses to the book, you know, about labeling stuff as genocide, or whether there was an intention to eliminate all Igbo peoples. And I think that's part of what I was trying to move away from, right? That way of thinking about genocide itself. You know, and there's something problematic about framing that past in that way. For example, what is intention and how do we measure it? You know, whose intention are we talking about here? Yeah, so I wanted to make it clear that genocide isn't a thing we go out to discover, you know, as Catherine put it insightfully. It's something constructed through different processes, social processes of, you know, the same with different contexts that or concepts that we use. You know, Africa, for example, what does that mean outside of the discourse that enabled that understanding or use of the concept, you know, beyond the geographical places that we refer to as Africa. So I wanted to move away from that way of thinking because I felt it's limiting, not just in the sense in which it raises these simplistic polemics of the Igbo were defending themselves, and you know that complicates their agency. I don't agree that that defending yourself, I mean, Jewish people defended themselves, right? Tutsis defended themselves. You barely find a victim, a context of that kind of atrocity where victims weren't involved in some defense or reason. I think I shared this story once in the context of Rwanda, where a survivor narrated an incident where victims were gathered, I think, in a stadium, and they were being killed, and they screamed and shouted and cried, pleaded with the killers, and the killers kept on going. And suddenly, according to this survivor, something strange happened, and there was this silence, and the victims stood there looking at them and refusing to cry. You know, and the hackers couldn't explain what happened, but they themselves began to cry, pleading with the victims to make killing easy, to cry and shout or run or resist so that they could easily kill them or make it easier for them to engage in that act of killing. I think that in itself is a form of resistance, is a form of fighting back, right? So I don't think that question even arises in the context of Biafra, where defense is now used against victims to delegitimize any claims of genocide, whether it's, you know, based on the UN Genocide Convention's definition, or whichever way different peoples are making sense of what that concept might mean. But in the specific context of Nigeria, because I know there's always that controversy, and it's a very political form of controversy, right? So in that sense, I want to respond directly that if we understand genocide in its official sense, for whatever that means in the legal context in which that word is deployed, what happened in Nigeria was genocide, right? Very clearly. But the politics behind legitimizing atrocities as genocide is a different question, right? And that politics was against victim groups. I mean, even when Rwanda was happening in 1994, it wasn't called a genocide. It was much after. Part of what informed that, I think, was the victory of the RPF, right? And what the politics that followed after and so on. So that politics informing what is recognizable as genocide and so on, I think is part of what I was interested in calling attention to. In the Nigerian context, part of the denialist politics is to deploy what I think is called the minority discourse, right? So the minority discourse asks us, I think that's also what this book you referenced does, Wemapan's new book. But even before that, his collection of short stories, there's a story there on the killings in the early 2000s and so on. And I think that story also does something similar to this book. So the minority discourse is, in the Nigerian sense, a political way to dismiss the question of genocide, and say, well, you are also killing minorities, even when that is proven or not. It becomes the Igbo, right, is killing. Not that there's a Biafran government military, for example, or that there are groups doing any kind of unseemly things. It becomes the Igbo generic. Again, that discuss on how a group, a collective, could be imagined as responsible or guilty for what specific individuals had done, right? So we don't say in the Nigerian context that the Yoruba generically perpetrated genocide because Awolowo was involved, right? We are talking about the Nigerian government as recognizable in its official sense as an authority, right? So I mean, those kinds of political underpinnings, denialist discourses and so on, I think are part of what, because I wasn't interested in the minority question in this sense, but yeah, I just wasn't so interested in the labels or stating very clearly that this or not is genocide. I was more interested in how the literatures are constructing ideas of genocide based on what I think that the writers of these books believe themselves to be writing about genocides, and not exactly war, civil war in the sense in which we want to read that past. I will come to you in a bit, but let me just run through some of this. Yeah, so the question of yeah, I mean, the question of justice. So there's something, I think it was Mahmoud Mamdani who talked about political justice, right? As a way to understand, and I think he was speaking specifically to the South African context of how the TRC, for example, in South Africa, distracted attention from the political victory, if you put it that way, of the struggle against apartheid, which is the enfranchisement of Black South Africans, right? The fact that they could vote and be voted for, and they have political victory in that, in that sense. But the memory, the dominant international memory of the South African struggle is the TRC, and the trauma inaugurated based on the testimonies and so on, but not that political dimension. And he's talking about that idea of political justice as a better framework to focus attention on, because I think thinking about political justice helps us to rethink the nation state structure bequeathed on Africa by colonizers, a structure that necessitates the kinds of mass atrocities that we continue to witness. So maybe that's perhaps displacing the trauma trope, not because it's not exactly very useful, but finding a way to link it to that idea of political justice, I think is not exactly what I did in this book, but I think it's one alternative way to think about justice in this context, right? Again, the Biafran struggle was in a way, it wasn't, I don't think it was perfect in any sense, but it was a response to that nation state structure that produced enormous amount of dead bodies and pain and violence. So yeah, thinking about political justice, I think, is one way to look at the question of justice in the context of Biafra. And even in the context of Rwanda, what does that look like? Because the RPF took over and inaugurated the particular political system governed using the memory of a genocide, and continues to deploy that in its hold onto totalitarian power, right? So what does that look like in different African contexts? What does political justice look like? I think is one question that I'm interested in exploring going forward. Yeah, but the last question here, I think on aesthetics is a very difficult one. I don't think, and I think Catherine also raised a similar question in terms of the limitations of the novel form, perhaps as part of what these writers, and I think Diop's Murambi, the Book of Bones, highlights that even more clearly for me, in the way that I think the writer, and even the writer has said this in a couple of interviews, first is choosing to write fiction about a genocide, right? And in the Nigerian context, I know that many of the early works from the 70s to the mid 1980s, the accusation was that they weren't exactly very aesthetic, for which they were treated as poor literatures or biased forms of literatures, or literatures that were overly invested in it's the yeah, so it's first, what is the goal of art itself in the context of a response to these kinds of atrocities, right? Why are writers doing art in the way that they choose to do it? I don't know if the problem is a problem of the novel, and I haven't seen a lot of drama from the context of Rwanda, for example. Nigerian context, a couple easily come to mind, Shoyinka's plays, Madmen and Specialists, for example, but also even Death and the King's Horseman, to a very large extent is connected. And I think one Nigerian critic recently connected that play to the Biafran War. But yeah, I think poetry, actually, we have more poetic contributions from both contexts than drama, which is what I'm looking at currently, trying to read up some of the new poetry works done on those experiences. But fiction, I thought, had more contributions. People have written a lot of fiction, but also a lot of memoirs and nonfiction, which again raises questions about memory. And I'll get to Christopher's moving away from the Holocaust studies thing to memory studies and so on. But yeah, questions about aesthetics, I think, are difficult for me to answer, but I'll be happy to hear more what you might think about the aesthetic question in the context of Rwanda and Nigeria. Catherine's focus on quests, I think is superb. I learned a lot listening to your reading of the book. Thanks a lot. And you know, I don't know if there are alternative models to the quests genre in this sense. Of course, there might be a couple of, I was looking at not just works on these experiences. I was looking at works that the writers at least give themselves away as writing genocide, you know, somehow, either through something they've said or through the kinds of activisms that they've involved themselves in. I know there are some other writers in the Nigerian context, you know, someone like Cyprian Ekwensi, who thought genocide happened and said it in guised ways at different times. But when I read his works, I thought he was more invested in something slightly different, but he comes close. But again, in his work, you have quests, you know, survive the peace, you know, something about that kind of quests. You know, there's also that figure like a journalist in this case, you know, who is moving around and trying to make sense of something or discover or find something. Some other works like Heroes by Festus Iyayi is similarly, you know, in that sense of, you know, someone who goes into the other side of things to see the war and then gets there and realizes, but this is not war, this is slaughter. What's going on? What is this war that they are talking about, right? So there are, you know, that quest thing seems to be, and I don't know why we are invested in going to hell to find the ethics for living, and we don't go to heaven to look for morals. It's interesting. We journey to hell, especially in the African context, and it's not something new. You know, that's part of what we quarrel with, for example, in Conrad's work, but in a lot of colonial works that staged Africa as the site of hell. Yeah, so that trope, I think, is pervasive. And in the context of genocide, particularly genocide understood from that Holocaust discourse, I think it activates that quest trope in a very interesting ways. Yeah, so does the fault lie with the novel form itself as a form for writing genocide? Maybe it's a question of literature generally and the role that literature plays. But if I can use Diop to respond, you know, part of it is also the refusal to accept cynicism as, which I think many of these writers, that's their disposition to these kinds of atrocities, and the refusal to allow the violence to win, you know, to make people not to talk or speak in a meaningful way about what happened to different peoples, or to give voice to the dead, you know, who have died. When we see the corpses scattered all over in Rwanda, what do we do with that? You know, are they meaningless? Are they useless? If they are useless, you know, what does that do? Who wins with that kind of attitude? In the Nigerian context, what does the silence, you know, of that past do? Does it suggest that millions of deaths were useless and so on? So I thought working against that kind of cynicism is part of this quest to find some form of meaning, but then the limitations to that quest for meaning, I think, and you are right, I don't have an answer to that. And to confess, the subtitle I used initially was Failures of Meaning, right? And one of the reviewers said, well, I think he should reframe it to quest for meaningfulness, that it seems to capture something more rather than emphasize on the negative. And I felt, yeah, that probably worked, but probably that didn't change the spirit that I used to engage the project in the first place. But that was, the original title of the work. It was Failures of Meaning, because I thought they were quests, but these quests for me failed to generate the kinds of usable meanings that I was looking for. But I don't know what that meaning, because to assume that there are usable meanings means you know what that meaning is when you see it. So and then that counters again the social process that I was tracing or tracking in the project. So yeah, I agreed with the reviewer's suggestion to use this subtitle of quest, and I thought it helped to draw or generate more kinds of conversations as your engagement proves to me. So thanks for focusing on that. Christopher, I mean, your work was, I felt I should have read your work before publishing this book. And the time I read your work and reviewed it, this book was already with published and advanced. But I mean, your reading of Adichie was superb. I haven't read anyone who engaged Adichie that deeply, as you did. So I can always agree with your critiques, my engagement of Adichie's, and again, it's also say one of the reviewers thought I was too harsh on Adichie, that I could be a bit more nuanced. I don't like the word nuance when it's used, but yeah, I could see the point you were making about the masculinist tropes of nationalism as one of the kinds of critiques that novel offers in that sense. I think I was more interested in the influences in forming the specific tropes that I saw, not just in Half of a Yellow Sun, but in Adichie's other works, and maybe it's my own way of reading Adichie, because I felt, there's that actually thing that she bounces off on, and I thought there was a strong Okonkwo trope not mentioned, and because that Okonkwo imagery is the dominant or stereotypical Igbo image of the Igbo man in popular Nigerian imaginary of Igbo masculinity, and giving also the history of things, the success of Things Fall Apart, there's a mixed feeling about that imagery. So on the one hand, it's the heroic maleness that some of us want to embrace, this maleness that confronts colonization and chooses to die rather than be humiliated in a sense. And it's celebrated as a heroic kind of maleness in the confrontation with superior adversity, which again Biafra seemed to dramatize in a very interesting ways. And Ojukwu was, the embodies that Okonkwo spirit, significantly, and so on. So I thought there was that thing going on with Half of a Yellow Sun and the kinds of connections to that. Maybe I took that too out of context, but I could see the way that played out, and more or less turned what I thought was a critique of genocide, or at least a grappling with the theme of genocide in the book on its head by blaming Igbo maleness for a lot of the atrocities that happened. So I think the question of genocide studies and memory studies, or instead of Holocaust, I think even memory studies it developed out of the Holocaust, right? It's the strong influence of memories, at least the Western discourse on memory studies, is significantly oriented to Holocaust studies, especially in the 80s when they turned attention to, and I mean memory studies in the trauma, the memory studies that developed out of trauma studies, and that became the dominant or dominated the discourse of memory studies from the 80s, but especially from the 90s. I thought that which again was part of the legacy of how the Holocaust, more or less, is spread across different discourses and came to signify the reference point to a lot of what we do today in the academia, even the idea of globalization and how memory studies helped to spread or discuss the Holocaust into a form of the globalizing process. These were some of the questions asked in the late 90s by, I've forgotten the name of these German scholars were asking, I think Nathan Snyder and the co-author, asking why the Holocaust became globalized and what that meant and so on, right? Yeah, but so I don't know, I think multidirectional memory explains to a very large extent what that process might look like, whether it's through Holocaust studies or genocide studies. And again, the question, I think it was, yeah, you asked that question about dehistoricizing the Holocaust based on the way we are reading genocide. I thought that question is Lars Heten answers that in the context of Biafra. The idea being that those comparisons work to dehistoricize and decontextualize not just the African, specific African histories that we are discussing, but also the specific German history that, so the Holocaust in that sense becomes removed from that historical context and becomes the symbol or metaphorical symbol of evil, right? And as a symbol of evil, it's more like a religious concept now, no longer a historical or political form of violence, right? Yeah, but again, I'm not answering your question. I'm just saying things that could invite you to say more, right? So, but overall, I think our chair has disappeared. Okay, she's back. I just want to thank you all for your insights and for being generous with with this work. I hope to hear more. Anyway.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry I missed out on much of what you said because I got internet connected.
You are frozen.
Yeah, we've lost you again, Orteo. I don't. So although you're not muted, we can't hear you. Arthur, I don't know if you spotted, we do have a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to have a look at that because I don't think we've got that much time left, but there's a really useful question.
I sorry to interrupt, but I also do have like a response to Chigbo, and I just feel like it's so burning that I have to say it. But maybe you might want to respond to the question first. Yeah. Hello? Is anyone there?
Yes, I'm trying to read the question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, anyone can take a crack at the question. I can also do that.
I think it'd be nice to hear from you, Arthur. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, these Otisifon, thanks for this question. Well, these questions, because these are loaded questions. Well, I don't know if others can, maybe I can read it out for the benefit of those in attending in the audience. Thanks for the very insightful presentations. I'm wondering if the panelists and the author could speak more about how this groundbreaking work gestures towards a novel approach to African literary scholarship that bestrides specificity and generality. In other words, how does Professor Anyaduba's deployment of genocide as critical analytic, drawn from a specific European historical moment, intersect with the impulse to analyze these texts as producing unique conceptual footprints that even trouble canonical conceptions of genocide? And to what extent can this tension be generative for the larger project of reading African novels as intersections of specifically African experiences and wider global discourses? Yeah, it's part of, I mean, we can't answer this question. I don't believe there's a right or wrong answer to this question, but part of the project here is to, for me, it's to understand the influences informing not just how writers are making sense of relative writing, but also how we are discussing and reading their works. One way is my reading of these novels could easily be critiqued as largely shaped by my exposure to genocide studies and the way I'm reading genocide into these works, right? At the same time, it could be calling attention to the larger questions that inform how we are reading text. My own is to create that consciousness that the way we read is not innocent. It's largely influenced and shaped by some of these discourses. So in the Nigerian context, the way we readily recognize text as civil war literatures without necessarily questioning what we mean by civil war as a framework of reading, I think is part of that project of being deliberate in terms of how we are coming to make sense of many of these works.
Sorry, do I get to say something now?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead. Second.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chigbo. And I think you probably know this, that we are on the same page in terms of like the way Nigeria has treated Biafra. I also have a reading of Adichie coming soon in my book that I'm working on and that you're aware of. And we are on the same page about the continuous victimization of Biafra that still continues to go on in Nigeria today, right? But again, we shouldn't blind our eyes to the fact that this is a very ethnically charged history, and you come to it, the way you read it also depends on the ethnic group that you belong to. And you know that, I mean, I'm Nigerian, you're Nigerian, and that's why, when you say that you're trying to avoid that labeling of the labeling of Biafra as genocide, that's something that you cannot avoid, because even when you do not read it that way, people are going to read it that way, because this is a very touchy issue in Nigeria. And you just really mentioned that, the way we read is not innocent. And for me, one of the things that I find interesting about your work actually is not that, you read genocide into the works, but that you help us to see how the works help us to read genocide. Actually, that's the way that I see it. But let's not blind our eyes to the fact that, this is an ethnically charged issue, and also the way you see it depends on the ethnic group that you belong to. And that's why I was raising the fact that theoretically, yes, I get it, this is genocidal. Like, even going by the UNGC's definition, it's a genocide. But in practice, that's the thing that I'm trying to tease out, because when you call it a genocide, a lot of questions come up, and again, that's not what you're doing. You're not saying labeling it as a genocide, but rather trying to tease out the meanings of genocide that the works generate. But when we call it genocide, a lot of questions also come up about accountability, about responsibility, about retribution, and it becomes really very complicated and in that way. And also the other thing that I wanted to say is that when I talk about Igbo's heroism in Biafra, again, it's not to defend the Nigerian, federal government for the evil that was done, but I think that, we can carry, stories of victimization and heroism at the same time, and Biafra is also a secessionist struggle, right? It's not like Tutsi wanting to leave, Rwanda, or the Jews wanting to leave Europe. It's a secessionist struggle, and Biafra had its own army and was supported by soldiers from countries like South Africa, France.
We have to round up.
Sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to put it.
Yes, because LSA is flashing 1 minute. We have less than 1 minute, but you can finish just the other.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to clarify a point that I made earlier.
Okay,
there's room to reading this as genocide, but also I think we should give room also for the complexities. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, everybody. I thought it was going to be possible to share a thing or two. It's okay. It's fine. It's been I didn't expect anything less when I saw the array of the credentials of the discussants. I knew we were going to have a very fruitful outing this evening. So thank you all for coming. I hope the book, it's a must read and a must have for students, teachers, researchers, sociologists, anthropologists, not just in literature, everywhere. It's a good one. And I hope it's affordable, or it will be made accessible at the very least.
It's actually open access, so anyone can download it from the publishers.
Great. So that our students can have easy access also, because it's a good one for them. I want to thank everybody. Catherine, thank you very much. Christopher, thank you. Sakiru, thank you very much. My very good friend, Chigbo, thank you. It's been a good outing. Stay well, everybody, and keep safe.
Hi, Chris. Bye. Good to meet you, to see you again.
Thank you. So nice to see you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.